Welcome to this introduction to Grungifier. Grungifier can add a lot of character and detail to your environment without adding any performance or memory overhead. Let's get a quick overview of what Grungifier is capable of. Here you see the same tower model, one with a grunge map applied using Grungifier, and one with just its basic tiling textures. So the brick is a single tiled texture, and the doors are another texture. And even though I've used different scales of the brick texture in different parts of this model, you can still see it looks very repetitive, very tiled looking, and it generally results in kind of a bland appearance. And this is even more so with larger surfaces, larger walls, towers, floors, ceilings, roads, things like that. But of course we really need to be able to use tiling textures, because otherwise we would either have to sacrifice a lot of resolution and wind up with a lot less detail on our model, or perhaps use a lot more texture memory to use enormous textures, or have to use more memory by using multiple textures and also incur additional draw calls. And all of this is going to negatively impact performance. So we want to be able to stick with a model that for the most part just uses tiling textures, but we want to be able to mask all of the monotonous repetition of the tiling texture while also adding character to the model. And that's what Grungifier helps us do. So the tower on the left that uses Grungifier is the exact same model. Both are light mapped, but this one has a grunge map applied to its light map using Grungifier. And as you can see, the grunge map allows you to add a lot of asymmetry and a lot of detail that not only adds character to the model, but breaks up the repetitive monotony of your tiled texture. And it does this without having to add any additional geometry and without using any additional memory, because all of these details are actually written into the light map. And this has certain advantages over an approach like decals, because it doesn't add any additional geometry, it doesn't add any additional memory footprint, and it can easily conform to the complex geometry of your model. So let's get another look at this from a different angle. And as you can see, the grunge conforms to the model because it's actually part of the light map. Now let's look at another example. Here is the same model of a room on both sides. The left one has a grunge map applied to it using Grungifier, and the one on the right does not. They're both light mapped, but the one on the left has grunge maps applied. So let's have a closer look at our grunge mapped version. So as you can see, we've got lots of additional detail here. We've got cracks in the floor, we've got stains running down the wall and into a grate, and stains on the grate itself as well. We've got blood, graffiti, plaster peeling off, stains running down from the pipe. And if we take a closer look at this pipe, you'll see we also even have some rust features coming from the joints of the pipe here. So we've got all this additional detail that adds character, and if we compare that with the room without the grunge map, you can see it's much more plain. It's very obvious that this is just a tiling texture, a couple of tiling textures here. We've got one for the ceiling and walls and another that we're using for the floor. Our pipe doesn't have any of the rust effects on it, so it looks very bland compared to the grunge mapped version. And we were able to add all of this character and detail around irregular geometry like this pipe, and without adding any additional geometry, draw calls, or memory usage. So now let's have a look at how easy it is to use Grungifier. So let's get started. The first thing you want to make sure of is that your model has a second set of UVs. Now here you can see I've got a model of a medieval tower, and I've already created a second set of UVs for light mapping purposes. Now you can have Unity generate the light mapping UVs for your model right here, and that can work okay if you're using a program such as Photoshop, Maya, etc. to paint directly onto your model in 3D. But the layout of those UVs isn't necessarily going to be perfect if you're just wanting to be able to paint directly onto your grunge map texture. Now, in case you want to use this method, you can always check this box and press apply to re-import your model with the generated UVs. Then Grungifier has a script slightly modified from the Unity wiki to export those UVs to an OBJ file. And it actually exports the second set of UVs to the OBJ. And then you would paint directly onto your model from there. But I've already got my UVs set up, and I've arranged them in a very paintable manner, as I'll show you. So here is my model in Cheetah, and you'll see right now we're viewing UV set 1, so I'll switch it to UV set 2, and you'll see that these are the secondary light mapping UVs, and they're laid out in such a way that I can just paint on each face of the tower. Now, of course, when you're using a light map, all the UVs need to remain inside the area of the texture. You don't want to use any tiling. You don't want to go out of bounds. So now let's have a look at the texture that I created. And this texture is what we call a grunge map. This is basically a texture with nothing but the grunge that's going to be laid on top of our model. And you can see some of these features were painted in freehand using various brushing techniques, and other features were actually pasted in from decals. So some of these are actually like photographic streaks, rust streaks and so forth, that were just copied and pasted into this grunge map. And what you can usually do is, from your modeling application, you can export your UVs to a texture. So for example, in Cheetah we can do save UVs to PDF, and then you can open those in a layer in your paint program, and that will kind of serve as a guide to painting in your grunge map. Now don't forget again that you can also paint directly onto your model using a lot of different modeling programs as well as Photoshop. So however you go about creating your grunge map, the desire is to have an end result like this, where everything except the grunge is transparent. So let's go back to Unity and our sample project, and let's drag our tower model into our scene. Now one of the first things we'll want to do is add our Grungifier component to our model. Now this particular model has multiple submeshes, so if you'll see here, that's 1 and that's 2. And what we actually need to do is have a Grungifier component, which is this script right here, on each of the submeshes that has its own mesh renderer. So we could drag a Grungifier component onto each one of these separately, but Grungifier also comes with a nice menu option which makes it a little faster and easier. So we can actually select the root game object here, which is the parent to the submeshes, and then we can go to Edit, Grungifier, Add Grungifiers to selected hierarchy. And what that will do is that'll crawl down the hierarchy of game objects and add Grungifier components to all the game objects that have mesh renderers attached. So let's do that. And now you'll see that each one of these has a Grungifier component. Now the next step is to actually assign a grunge map texture to each of these components. So in this case, here is our grunge map that I showed you earlier, and I'll just add that on. Now we could hit apply here if we already had light maps for our scene, but we haven't baked any light maps yet. And what Grungifier does is it actually modifies the light map. So we need Unity to create our light maps for us. Now before we bake our light maps, we need to remember to mark our geometry as static so that it will get light mapped. So what we could do next is simply go to our light map baking, bake our scene, and then go through and apply our grunge map. But instead, Grungifier has a menu option that can do the entire baking process and then applying the grunge maps for us all in one step. So to do that, we go to Edit, Grungifier, Bake All. There's also a Bake for Selection option if you only want to bake part of the scene. But we're going to do Bake All. And then you'll see this window come up that says Grungifier, and it'll tell you not to close this window because basically this window is waiting for the light map baking process to complete, at which point it'll apply all the grunge maps. So if you close this window, the grunge maps won't get applied at the end of the baking process. You can still apply them as another step. Now you could also move that window out of the way. You don't have to leave it in the foreground, but just make sure not to close it. And there we have it. Our scene is light mapped, and Grungifier has applied the grunge maps to our model. Now, say for example, if we wanted to remove the grunge maps temporarily for whatever reason, we can do that as well by going in and disabling individual Grungifier components. So let's say if we just want to remove the grunge from this piece, if we simply disable the component on that particular piece, we can now re-import the associated light map by right-clicking and clicking re-import. And as you see, it's re-imported the light map without the grunge on it. Now if we want to reapply a particular grunge map, we can also, while we have the associated light map selected, we can click on the gear icon here, and we have a Grungify option that may be getting clipped by the recording software, but there's a Grungify option right there. Or we could go to the piece. Of course, we want to make sure that we've re-enabled the Grungifier component, or else it won't get applied. And we can click the apply button, and there we have it reapplied. And that's pretty much all there is to spicing up your environment with the grunge maps using Grungifier. As you can see, it's a very straightforward process, and if you're already using light maps, there's absolutely no additional overhead. Thanks for watching.